In December 2018, Salomondrin, one of the biggest car YouTubers at the time, posted something that genuinely stopped the car community in its tracks. His McLaren Senna had caught fire on a California highway, and not under any circumstances that made sense. This was not after a crash, not after an aggressive track session, not after any kind of abuse. The car had been in his hands for 11 days and had roughly 400 miles on it.
Beloved McLaren Senna, after 11 or 12 days of having it, just caught up on fire and basically melted to the ground.
It just caught fire on its own, and by the time firefighters arrived, one of only 500 ever built was essentially destroyed. The story spread the way only the most shocking car stories do, because the Senna was not some ordinary sports car that had slipped through quality control. It cost close to $1 million, carried the name of Ayrton Senna, and every single unit had been sold before production even started. Watching one burn to the ground 11 days after delivery was genuinely hard to process. Most people assumed McLaren would handle it quietly and professionally, make it right, and move on. But as more details came out, the story became a lot more complicated than a simple warranty claim. Because it turned out McLaren had already been investigating fire risks across their lineup before this fire ever happened. And when they eventually announced a recall covering nearly 2,800 vehicles, including the Senna, the problem wasn't some exotic failure deep inside a cutting-edge drivetrain. It was a foam pad beneath the fuel tank that could trap moisture, corrode the metal, and create exactly the conditions needed for a fuel leak and a fire. That detail changes the entire framing of what happened, and that's what we're going to get into today. To understand why this story hit so hard, you need to understand what the McLaren Senna actually was. McLaren described it as the most extreme road car they had ever built, and that wasn't marketing language. The Senna ran a 4.0-liter twin-turbocharged V8, producing 800 horsepower and 800 newton-meters of torque, paired with a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. It could hit 60 miles per hour in around 2.6 seconds, and top out at over 208 miles per hour. The entire car was built around a carbon fiber chassis, weighed just under 1,200 kilograms, and was covered in aggressive aerodynamic elements, active flaps, air channels, and an enormous rear wing, all designed to generate massive downforce and keep the car planted at speeds that most drivers will never experience in their lives. And only 500 of them were ever made. Every single unit was sold before production even began. McLaren named the car after Ayrton Senna, one of the most celebrated Formula One drivers in history, which tells you everything about the kind of statement they were trying to make with it. This wasn't a Grand Tour or a comfortable weekend car. Many owners actually chose stripped-down interiors and exposed carbon fiber panels specifically to save weight. The entire philosophy of the car was performance above everything else. So when one of those 500 cars burned down 11 days after delivery, people took it personally. Enthusiasts immediately assumed McLaren would go out of their way to make things right. And honestly, that was a reasonable assumption. The expectation was that a company selling near million-dollar hypercars with their most legendary name attached would handle a situation like this with urgency and transparency. Instead, McLaren made no immediate public statement. Preliminary reports pointed to the engine bay as the origin of the fire, with no evidence of any collision, making a defect the most obvious explanation. Salomondrin confirmed that an internal investigation had been launched.
McLaren has announced that they're recalling 2,800 cars, and a lot of people are asking me, and including one of them, the Senna, for a major risk of fire.
And beyond that, there was mostly silence from the manufacturer. The public was left to speculate, and as you can probably guess, they had plenty to say. In the days after the fire, investigators scoured the scene but didn't come back with any clear answers right away. In the meantime, the internet had already taken over. Cell phone footage of the burning Senna spread across forums and social media within hours. And when police released images of the scorched chassis started circulating, the reaction was visceral. The photo showed the rear of the car completely destroyed while the front remained mostly intact, which to most people immediately suggested the fire had started somewhere around the engine bay and worked its way forward before crews could put it out. Salomondrin went live to walk people through what actually happened. He said he was driving with his wife when he noticed sparks and flames coming from the exhaust area while climbing a hill.
That started basically, I was driving on a stretch of road by my house really close, going up a little hill. The moment I started going up the hill, I saw some sparks from my rearview mirror. I looked up and immediately noticed that the exhaust was throwing flames into the ground.
Rather than pulling over immediately near the vegetation on the roadside, he kept the car rolling and shifted into neutral so he could coast to a safer open area before getting out and calling emergency services. It was a quick thinking decision that likely prevented the fire from spreading beyond the car itself. By the time firefighters arrived, there was nothing left to save. Witnesses described the fire intensifying rapidly while they waited for emergency crews, with loud pops and small explosions coming from the rear of the car as the flames spread. The heat destroyed the engine bay, melted through plastics and carbon fiber components, and eventually consumed most of the interior. Salomondrin said he simply couldn't do anything, and looking at the aftermath photos, that was easy to believe. Public reaction split almost immediately. A lot of people sympathized with him, but plenty of others were skeptical, questioning how a car at that price point could just spontaneously catch fire. The fact that it had only been 11 days since delivery made the whole thing feel even harder to accept. Speculation about a manufacturer defect, a warranty claim, or even a potential recall started picking up quickly across forums and comment sections. What actually happened legally was a little less dramatic than some expected. Salomondrin himself didn't end up suing McLaren directly.
I never, not once, tried to sue McLaren.
According to later comments he made, it was his insurance company that pursued a class action suit alongside other insurers.
My insurance company did call me one day, like about, I think starting this year, and they said, look, McLaren doesn't want to admit responsibility for any of this, so we will issue you a refund.
So while the internet was bracing for a very public legal battle between a YouTuber and one of the most prestigious supercar brands in the world, the reality was a lot quieter than that. Behind the scenes, the investigation was moving slowly. Neither the California Highway Patrol nor McLaren released any detailed findings publicly, but fire department logs confirmed the Senna had self-ignited, with investigators focusing on the fuel and electrical systems. Engineers examined what was left of the car, trying to work out whether the fire had started from a fuel leak, an electrical failure, or heat buildup inside the tightly packed engine bay. Then something interesting surfaced. Before Salomondrin's fire had even happened, McLaren had already been looking into fire risks across their lineup. A separate incident involving a different McLaren model months earlier had quietly prompted the company to take a closer look at their designs. And by early January 2020, they announced a global recall covering nearly 2,800 vehicles, including the 720S, the 570 GT, the GT, and the Senna. The cause they identified was not what most people were expecting. It wasn't a turbocharger failure or some exotic engineering problem. It was a noise-dampening foam pad sitting beneath the fuel tank that could trap moisture, corrode the metal over time, and eventually create small perforations that allowed fuel or vapor to leak out. McLaren said they would inspect and replace affected components free of charge at authorized dealers. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, though. McLaren was careful to never officially connect this recall to Salomondrin's fire, stating his case was still under separate investigation. But the timing was hard to ignore, and the theory that public pressure from his case had forced McLaren's hand spread quickly online. McLaren pushed back quietly, with reports indicating the foam issue had been identified during pre-production testing well before Salomondrin's fire ever happened. Whether you find that reassuring or more concerning probably depends on how generous you're feeling toward the manufacturer, because if the problem was already known from pre-production testing and still made it out to customers, the recall being already in motion doesn't exactly close the case. Salomondrin kept his audience updated through the whole thing, and his take was surprisingly measured for someone who had just watched a $1 million car burn to nothing. He framed it simply, saying the Senna burned itself, and that all he wanted was fair compensation. He repeatedly made clear there had been no crash or any outside trigger, nothing he had done wrong. Reports emerged that he had filed a claim and was pursuing action against McLaren, though it later became clear it was his insurance company leading that effort rather than a personal lawsuit. Some viewers read his videos as preparation for a major legal battle, while others thought he was just documenting a very expensive insurance claim, which is a reasonable thing to do. What got more attention was what he did next. In January 2019, he started listing cars from his collection, including a Porsche Carrera GT, a McLaren 720S, and a Mercedes AMG GTR. His critics framed it as him throwing a fit and cashing out, but as one observer put it at the time, anyone would develop a distaste for a manufacturer if their week-old $1 million car burned up. He also hinted at stepping back from hypercars entirely, suggesting the experience had made him question whether owning cars at that level was worth the stress. His videos covering the aftermath pulled hundreds of thousands of views, which showed that the story had genuinely taken on a life of its own. What started as a single incident on a California highway had turned into a months-long saga that the car community was fully invested in following. Through all of this, McLaren's direct role stayed frustratingly unclear. there was never an official statement accepting fault in Salomondrin's case specifically, and to the public, their main response was simply the recall program that was already in motion. Whether that was genuine transparency or careful legal positioning was something nobody could say for certain. Some observers tried to put the incident in perspective by pointing out that by the time of Salomondrin's fire, all 500 Sennas had already been delivered worldwide. Only 2 fires had been reported publicly at that point, which suggested this might have been an extremely rare failure rather than a widespread defect. It was a fair point, though not necessarily a comforting one if you happen to own one of the 2 that burned. What kept the speculation alive was a detail that surfaced in photos of the wreckage. Enthusiasts noticed charred foam residue beneath the fuel tank area, which immediately connected the fire in people's minds to the exact component McLaren had cited in their recall. Engineers and analysts who followed the story suggested the foam issue alone probably wasn't enough to cause what happened, and that the more likely explanation was a combination of factors, including the tightly packaged engine bay, the extreme operating temperatures, and the density of fuel lines, turbochargers, and heat shielding all packed into a small space. In a car running at that level, a small problem can escalate into a serious fire faster than most people would expect. But without an official report confirming any of this, it all remained theory. Even years later, the exact cause of Salomondrin's fire has never been publicly confirmed, which in its own way says quite a lot. By mid-2019, the story had mostly run its course. Salomondrin confirmed his insurers had pursued a claim, and he appeared satisfied with the outcome, though the details stayed private. He parted ways with several cars and moved on to other things on his channel. McLaren, for their part, continued Senna production with no further public comment on the incident beyond politely stating they were glad no one was hurt and that they were investigating every case thoroughly. But the story never fully went away. It gets brought up whenever someone wants to cite a strange supercar failure, sitting comfortably alongside cases like the Porsche 918 fire in the catalog of things that were not supposed to happen to cars at that level. The phrase McLaren Senna fire still surfaces regularly on forums, and Salomondrin's name is permanently attached to it. What the whole episode really left behind was a simple and uncomfortable reminder. No car is immune to failure, regardless of the price tag, the name on the badge, or how many times engineers signed off on it before delivery. And when something does go wrong at that level, the answers rarely come as cleanly as the people asking for them deserve. Whether McLaren handled this well is something people still disagree on, but the story itself, a $1 million hypercar burning on a California hillside 11 days after delivery, is not something the car community is going to forget anytime soon. Tuna No Crust, signing off.